people just react to Trump's tweets. Like whenever Trump says things are going well, oil futures go down and the stock market goes up, and the relevant poly markets go in the direction of his statement. And then there's usually a 2 to 3 day period of people looking more deeply into the issue, or the Iranians not reciprocating what the Trump administration is saying, and then the gap will start to close.
Hi, I'm Shira.
And I'm Jordan.
And this is Mispriced by Quotient. Trade the narrative at app.quotient.social. So today we're going to cover two markets that share a similar story. The first is the US-Iran diplomatic meeting happening before May 5th, and the second market is on the Strait of Hormuz, reopening by the end of May. And so this is all associated with the narrative that's currently on our site at app.quotient.social. So the first market is the US-Iran meeting by May 5th. Poly market has it at 17.5%. You can see there's been fluctuation over the past week or so. We have it at 11. So it's a pretty tight spread, but there's still some kind of interesting opportunities to understand what's going on here. So to clarify, the resolution criteria is a key component of this. So the meeting must be in person, and it must be publicly acknowledged by either government or reported by consensus of credible media. And this all needs to happen before 11:59 p.m. on May 5th. And what's interesting within the resolution criteria is that phone calls don't count, brief greetings don't count, and secret proximity talks don't count. And what Q has already seen as to what's going on here is that kind of both governments carry a lot of kind of political costs for admitting some in-person diplomacy right after canceling it. And Q's also been reporting that Iran has some diplomatic infrastructure already in place in Muscat, which makes some indirect proximity talks like a more obvious move. But those indirect proximity talks wouldn't meet the resolution criteria. So this isn't that far away. It's like 8 days away. And I'm just trying to better understand, like, why is there so much posturing around meeting in person?
Well, there were in-person talks scheduled in Islamabad last week, and the Trump administration was prepared to send representatives to those talks. But the talks fell through because the US didn't accept the Iranians' preconditions for holding the negotiations, and the Iranians felt that they would be a waste of time. And this frustrated the Trump administration and Trump, which is why Trump stated that he wasn't going to send delegates to in-person talks in Islamabad, the 15-hour flight and all the infrastructure necessary to send senior US officials there if negotiations weren't actually going to happen, and that if the Iranians wanted to talk to the US, they could call on the phone. So that's kind of like the short story for why talks are unlikely, because it's easier to dial up the people that you want to talk to and save time. But more fundamentally, I think that the reason that you're seeing such tension around the talks is that the Iranians feel like the Trump administration isn't treating them with respect, and they don't want to negotiate with the Trump administration under kind of like a specter of threat, and where the Trump administration is trying to shape the negotiating landscape through provocative tweets. So like earlier today, for instance, the White House and Trump tweeted, Iran has just informed us that they're in a state of collapse. They want us to open the Strait of Hormuz as soon as possible as they try to figure out their leadership situation. So Trump is basically saying we can't negotiate with these people because they don't know who's in charge, right? If you look at people on the Iranian side, they're kind of trolling this attitude from Trump. Like Syed Mohammad Marandi is a public intellectual in Iran who has a big following and accompanied the Iranian negotiating team to the last round of talks in Islamabad. And he jokes that he was the one who called Trump. Or you have the Iranian embassy in Ghana. If you aren't hyper online, the Iranian embassies have all been kind of like trolling Trump. And they're saying that he's hallucinating, that Trump is trying to cover for the fact that the US Navy is incapable of reopening the strait. So this is just kind of like fundamentally, unserious. Like the Trump administration isn't treating the Iranians with the level of kind of respect that they feel like they're entitled to. And putting aside kind of like the trolling, this has just been like an issue in US Iran negotiations for a while. Like this idea of the Iranians not wanting to negotiate under threat. So during the negotiations for the JCPOA, Mohammad Javad Zarif, who's the Iranian foreign minister, had this like big outburst about how you should never threaten an Iranian because the US team was making veiled threats about what would happen if a favorable deal wasn't reached. And this became viral in memes, right? And more recently, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who's leading the negotiations on the Iranian side, made statements about how they weren't going to negotiate under threat. So zooming out, like the Trump administration's position is we're going to keep the blockade on Iran. We're going to wait for them to come capitulate to our red lines. And if they want to talk, we'll talk with them. And the Iranians are like, this isn't even worth our time. Like if you're going to threaten us, you're not going to treat us like as a serious peer, then we're not going to negotiate with you. And that's kind of like the story of why we're at this impasse.
Do you think that the acknowledged part or the publicly acknowledged part of the resolution criteria is an important part of this? Is that what it's all about?
And it's about like fundamentally incompatible positions. Like the Iranians have stated that they're not going to give up nuclear enrichment permanently, although they might be willing to accept some sort of pause, perhaps, and that they're not going to give up their highly enriched uranium. Like that's like their public negotiating position. And the Trump administration's public negotiating position is that there has to be a very long pause and Iran has to give up its enriched uranium. So this is just like kind of a fundamental impasse. So as long as the Trump administration is stating that this is their position, even participating in the negotiations would be a capitulation from the Iranian side, right? So when it comes to like whether or not like the negotiations are publicly acknowledged, again, they have to be in person. So the publicly acknowledged part is like almost like a separate issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Iranians would not want it to be publicized that they were negotiating on backing down from their repeatedly stated red lines. So yeah, it just seems like there's not kind of the basic fundamental shared understanding of what the contours for a deal are. And until something happens that shifts one side's incentives like very significantly, we'll probably continue to be at a stalemate.
Yeah. And kind of moving on to the second market, like obviously like the Strait is a huge part of what's happening here. And Polymarket has it at about 41 in terms of like it opening or resuming to normal by the end of May. We have it at 11%, so that's about a 30%. What is interesting is that the resolution criteria is around IMF PortWatch and the 7-day moving average of those transit calls, and it needs to hit 60 ships by May 31st in order for this to resolve. And right now, I mean, it's fluctuated anywhere between like 5 to 13, and it's significantly depressed from where it was kind of during more normal times. And kind of what Q's already been seeing is that there's been reports that Iran can't locate all of its deployed sea mines. That feels like treacherous territories for ships going through it. That the Pentagon estimates that there would be about a 6-month time period in order to clear all of those mines. And we've talked about that on previous episodes about what it takes to do that and the ships and the process for that. And then also there is some kind of issue around kind of what the signal is in terms of what's being used for IMF PortWatch, that AIS signal.
I feel like you're saying that because ships are trying to evade detection by like turning off or spoofing their transponders, that IMF may not capture every ship that transits through there.
Yeah, like I saw in my feed yesterday that there was some like ginormous like Russian oligarch yacht that went through. I don't know if that was captured by IMF PortWatch. There's a lot going against the Strait not opening because it feels risky. And we saw even like late last week that there was reports that there were additional mines being laid by Iranian speedboats. So kind of what's going on here? Because there's also been some other kind of reports that that signal maybe the U.S. is more optimistic about the opening.
Yeah. So the US has an incentive to say that they're optimistic about the opening to calm down oil markets because, like, despite massive efforts to suppress the price of oil, it's ticking up pretty rapidly. Previously, like a month ago, the Trump administration was saying that despite Iranian threats, the Strait was safe to transit and that they would provide people insurance and like escort people's ships, and none of that happened. So I would kind of interpret that from the perspective of like the administration trying to keep markets calm. So, for instance, earlier today, the U.S. Secretary of Energy said that, hey, like, you don't have to get rid of all the mines for people to resume transiting the strait. We just have to get rid of some of them, and then you have like a pathway that some ships could go through. But then it's still like cool. So like the whole strait's not open, just like this pathway. We have to clear that pathway. Ostensibly, the Iranians are saying that the strait is closed and could attack ships trying to go through that pathway, which would require the U.S. Navy to escort those ships. And when you're escorting a ship, there's usually like a 3 to 4 kind of like Navy to commercial vessel ratio, which takes up space, which reduces the number of ships that can go through. So the idea is that given that there seems to be an impasse in the negotiations, and given that there's all of these kind of logistical challenges to solve in order to like reopen the strait to a reasonable level, even once the two sides have come to some sort of accommodation, that's why IQ is kind of forecasting that the odds are lower than the market.
And even with this kind of announcement by the energy secretary around that not all of the mines need to be cleared before it's open, and this is kind of what you were getting at also, like, is there even like enough space, even if they're not all clear and it's technically considered open, if we're thinking about it in relation to the resolution criteria, like, will we be able to get to the 60 ships happening over that 7-day moving average by the end of May?
Yeah,
Given all,
that's like about a third of what the strait usually holds. So I would say that if there's some sort of deal that's made, then like if it happened like today or in a week, then like maybe you would reach that like metric potentially. But until there is a deal, like the timeline for taking the steps necessary to get like a third of the traffic through as usual is pushed back, right? But just like more fundamentally, it's like it's closed right now. The negotiations aren't progressing. And even if the negotiations did reach a deal, it seems like it's going to take at least a few weeks to start getting a significant amount of ships through.
so what do you think the gap is here?
That people just react to Trump's tweets. Like
Right.
whenever Trump says like things are going well, oil futures go down and the stock market goes up, and the relevant poly markets go in the direction of his statement. And then there's usually a 2 to 3 day period of people looking more deeply into the issue, or of the Iranians not reciprocating what the Trump administration is saying, so on and so forth, and then the gap will start to close. But if
Yeah.
you go back to the chart, like 3 weeks ago, the odds of this were really high. They were over 80%. And then they went down when people got confronted with reality. So this is kind of just one example of many of people kind of trading on vibes and hope and not like the reality
Yeah.
on the ground.
Yeah. Well, that's all we have for today. As always, this is not financial advice. Do your own research. Would love for you to check out kind of the other narratives we have on our site at app.quotient.social, and have a great day.